She had been fired for 11 minutes when the rear admiral walked through the front doors and stopped dead in the middle of the lobby. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The man had 3 stars on his collar and a wall of Navy officers behind him, and he was staring at the woman security was quietly escorting toward the exit. A 32-year-old nurse with a slight limp and a cardboard box of personal items pressed against her chest. He didn't look at the chief administrator. He didn't look at the staff frozen behind the nurse's station. He looked only at her. "What's your call sign?" he asked. The lobby went silent in a way that lobbies almost never do. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the quiet of 40 people simultaneously forgetting to breathe. She met his eyes across 15 feet of polished hospital floor. "Ghost Raven." Rear Admiral Declan Marsh went rigid. Then he came to full attention, spine locked, chin level, heels together, and every officer behind him did the same within half a second, as if they'd rehearsed it. Nobody in Westbrook General Hospital understood what they were watching. Nobody understood why a decorated flag officer was standing at attention for a nurse with a cardboard box and a limp. They were about to find out, but not the way anyone expected. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where I need you. Follow this channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The day had begun the way most of Claire Duvall's days began at Westbrook General, early, understaffed, and already behind. She'd clocked in at 5:47 for a 6 o'clock shift, which meant she was the first nurse on the floor when the overnight team started handing off. 3rd floor, internal medicine, 1 orderly short, IV pump on Bay 4 throwing error codes nobody had bothered to log. She fixed the pump, took the handoff, and had already assessed 4 patients before the day shift's first coffee was poured. That was Claire. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, she'd stopped doing that a long time ago, but because standing still made the leg worse than moving did. 12-hour shifts actually suited her. The moment she stopped, everything tightened up. The limp was the first thing people noticed. It had been 17 months since she'd left the Army, and she still caught the looks. The quick downward glance, the fractional pause before someone spoke to her, the involuntary recalibration that happened in people's eyes when they registered that the nurse in front of them moved differently than they expected. She'd learned to read it in the first half second of every new interaction. Most people recovered fast enough that it didn't matter. Some people never recovered at all. Dr. Raymond Holt was in the second category, but he was just a surgeon with a superiority complex, and she could work around him. Dr. Marcus Vale was a different problem entirely. Vale was Westbrook General's Chief of Hospital Administration. Not a physician, never had been, which was something he compensated for by exercising authority over physicians with the enthusiasm of a man who'd waited his whole career for exactly this role. He was 54, trim in the way that suggested personal trainers rather than physical labor, and he had a voice that carried without apparent effort, which he used as a weapon. Claire had watched him reduce a 3rd-year resident to visible distress in the middle of a hallway, and then straighten his jacket and walk away as if he had just resolved something constructive. He had been on her case since her 2nd week at Westbrook. It started small. A comment about her documentation format, technically accurate, delivered loudly at the nurse's station with 3 colleagues in earshot. Then a question about whether her mobility limitation affected her ability to respond to codes, framed as concern, timed for maximum audience. Then a formal notation in her personnel file about inconsistent adherence to floor protocols that referenced 2 incidents she still couldn't identify because the documentation gave no specific dates. She'd filed an HR query about the notation. HR had responded in 6 days with a 3-sentence email that said nothing. She'd let it go. She was good at letting things go. The Army had taught her that particular skill, though not gently. What she was not good at, what she had never fully learned, was the performance of smallness that Vale seemed to require from the people beneath him. She couldn't do the deferential smile, the preemptive apology, the slight drop in posture that said, "I understand my position here." It wasn't stubbornness. It was a physical impossibility, the same way some people can't roll their tongue. Something in her nervous system simply refused. Vale had noticed. Vale had clearly decided to fix it. Tick. The morning of the inspection started with a text from the charge nurse, Priya Okonkwo, at 5:15. Military liaison visiting today. VIP protocols. Vale wants everyone in dress code by 700. Claire read it while lacing her shoes and didn't think much of it. Military liaisons visited hospital systems periodically. Procurement reviews, veteran care assessments, grant evaluations. She'd been on the periphery of 2 such visits in her time at Westbrook, and they'd been unremarkable. Walkthrough, handshake, paperwork. She arrived at 6, fixed the IV pump, took her hand off. By 7, she had assessed 6 patients, flagged 1 for attending review, and updated 3 charts. She was doing the thing she was always doing, not performing competence, but simply exercising it, because it was the only way she knew how to be in a clinical environment. Priya caught her in the medication room at 7:40. Heads up, Priya said quietly, glancing at the door. Vale's in rare form today. He walked the floor at 6:30 and made Darnell redo an entire admission note because the font size was wrong. The font size. I know. Okay. Claire pulled the medication she needed, double-checked the label. I'll stay out of his path. That's not... Priya paused. That's not really the thing I'm trying to tell you. Claire looked at her. He's been asking questions about you, Priya said, about your file. He went to HR yesterday afternoon, and I only know that because Janelle from HR mentioned it when she was getting coffee, and she looked uncomfortable about it. Claire set the medication down on the cart. What kind of questions? I don't know specifics, just... Priya's jaw tightened. Just be careful today, more careful than usual. That was the entire conversation. Priya left. Claire finished pulling medications, and she thought about what more careful than usual meant for someone who was already operating at maximum vigilance every single day. And she decided it didn't mean anything practical, so she went back to work. The military party arrived at 9:15. She heard it before she saw it. The change in ambient noise on the floor, the way conversation stopped mid-sentence, the particular quality of silence that descends when authority enters a space. She was at the bedside of a 67-year-old post-surgical patient named Gerald when she heard heels on the corridor tile, a distinctive cadence, and she finished what she was doing with Gerald before she turned around. 3 Navy officers in dress uniform, a civilian aide, Dr. Marcus Vale in a suit she hadn't seen before, cutting an angle just ahead of the group as if he were personally responsible for the architecture of the building. She recognized the rank insignia on the lead officer from 50 feet away without thinking about it. Rear Admiral, 2 stars, and the additional embellishment that denoted a specific command position she cataloged and filed in the back of her mind. He was mid-50s, built like someone who had never entirely left field work, silver at the temples, walking with the kind of deliberate economy of movement that wasn't trained in an office. She turned back to Gerald. You're going to want to keep that arm elevated through the night, she said, adjusting the pillow under his elbow. If the swelling doesn't reduce by morning, page me directly. Don't wait for rounds. You're always in a hurry, Gerald observed, in the amiable tone of a man who found her efficiency entertaining rather than dismissive. Busy floor, she said. That Admiral looks like he eats busy floors for breakfast. She almost smiled. Rest. She moved out of the room and down the corridor, away from the visiting group, which was the correct professional behavior and also the thing she would have done anyway. The inspection found her 20 minutes later. She was at the nurse's station updating a chart when Vale materialized at her peripheral vision with the military party in tow, and she heard him mid-sentence, his presentation voice running at full volume. Consistent standards across all departments. Our staff development program is nationally benchmarked, and we've maintained a nursing retention rate of... Excuse me. It wasn't Vale's voice, it was the Admiral's, and it had the particular quality of a voice accustomed to being the last voice in any exchange. She looked up from the chart. The Rear Admiral was looking directly at her. Vale had stopped talking, which apparently required effort. How long have you been on shift? The Admiral asked. Since 6, sir. He glanced at her badge. Duval. Not a question. Yes, sir. Vale moved slightly, a subtle positioning, as if to reclaim the conversation's geography. Nurse Duval is one of our floor staff. As I was saying, our development metrics. I'm aware you were saying something, the Admiral said without inflection, without looking at Vale. He was still looking at Claire. What's in room 314? It was a test. She understood that immediately, and she understood without knowing why that passing it or failing it mattered in a way she couldn't yet define. 62-year-old female, post-operative day 2 from a right hip arthroplasty, Claire said. Currently presenting with elevated temperature, 101.4 at last check, 40 minutes ago. I flagged it for attending review. The preliminary concern is early surgical site complication, possibly early stage SSI, but we're waiting on labs. She's on prophylactic antibiotics already. A pause. What's her pain presentation? Controlled on the current protocol, but she's been guarding more than the post-op baseline suggests she should be. I've documented it. Did the attending flag it, or did you? I flagged it. The attending will review it rounds. The Admiral nodded once, turned to Vale, said nothing. Vale's smile had gone slightly fixed, like a screen that was buffering. Yes, well, our nursing staff are excellent. What's your prior service? The Admiral asked, still looking at Claire. The question landed in a strange way. She felt the attention of the two officers flanking him shift, become more focused. I'm sorry, she said, though she'd heard him clearly. Prior military service, he said. You gave that assessment the way someone gives a salute report. Vale laughed, a short professional laugh, the kind deployed to smooth conversational friction. I don't think Nurse Duval has 7 years, Claire said. Army. She didn't elaborate. She didn't owe anyone an elaboration. The Admiral's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A recalibration, the same kind she usually clocked in people processing her limp, except this one moved in the opposite direction. Thank you, he said. And then, to Vale, please continue. Check. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. She was wrong in the particular way that people are wrong when something is already in motion that they can't see the edges of yet, when the architecture of a situation has been constructed around them and the last piece hasn't dropped into place. The last piece dropped at 2:17 in the afternoon. She was in the break room, standing rather than sitting, because sitting for any extended period made the leg lock up, and the 10-minute chair break would cost her 30 minutes of stiffness, eating a sandwich that had been refrigerated too long and was approximately 40% worse than it should have been. Priya came through the door with her phone in one hand and the expression of someone who had just processed information they hadn't wanted to receive. He called a meeting, Priya said. All floor nursing staff. Conference room B, right now. Claire set down the sandwich. Why? Vale, I don't... Priya stopped. The military party left an hour ago. He's been in his office since then, and now he wants everyone in Conference B, and Janelle from HR is already in there. That last detail landed differently than the rest. HR in the room meant documentation. HR documentation in the room meant that whatever was about to happen had been arranged in advance, which meant Priya's warning this morning had been accurate, and she had underestimated what careful needed to look like. Conference room B had a long table, 12 chairs, and a wall of windows overlooking the hospital's east parking structure. 7 nurses assembled within 4 minutes, some still in motion, pulling gloves off or setting tablet computers on the table. The charge nurse for the afternoon shift, a heavy-set man named Donald, who'd been at Westbrook for 11 years, sat at the far end with the expression of someone who had been briefed and didn't like what he'd been told. Vale came in last. HR Representative Janelle Torres was already seated with a folder and a laptop. Vale didn't sit. He opened with pleasantries. That was the first tell. Vale didn't do pleasantries unless they were tactical. He said something about the inspection going well and the hospital's continued commitment to excellence, and Claire watched 2 of the other nurses visibly relax, because the pleasantries sounded like a pre-meeting meeting, the kind that preceded an announcement about a new protocol or a scheduling change. Then he turned to her. Nurse Duval, he said, I want to address what happened this morning during the liaison visit. The room went still. Not the complete stillness of the lobby later, but a preliminary stillness, the kind that preceded it. I addressed the Admiral's questions accurately, she said. You engaged a visiting military official in an extended clinical discussion without authorization and provided assessments on patient cases that were not yours to present. She kept her voice level. He asked me direct questions. I answered them accurately. You created the impression that our nursing staff operates independently of physician oversight, which is not the image this institution needs to project during a high-visibility visit. That's not what I... You also implied that our attending physician had not yet reviewed a flagged case, which is both premature and inappropriate to communicate to an external party. The injustice of it sat in her chest like something physical. She had documented the flag. She had done exactly what protocol required. She had answered a direct question from a visiting official about a patient on her floor with precise and accurate clinical information, and what she was now being told was that accuracy had been the problem. She understood, in that moment, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that this had nothing to do with the inspection. This had been planned before the inspection. "Marcus," said Donald from the end of the table, his voice careful, "I think we need to be specific about which protocol." "Thank you, Donald," Vale said, the pleasantness in his tone now doing entirely different work. "I'm not asking for input on this." Donald stopped. Vale opened a folder. He went through 3 items in 2 minutes, each one a variation on the same theme. Nurse Duval's documentation practices, Nurse Duval's communication style, Nurse Duval's documented concerns about her ability to fulfill the physical requirements of the role. That last one landed differently than the others. It landed like something that had been written specifically to land the way it did, at this moment, in this room, in front of these witnesses. She felt something in her go very quiet. Not the anger. The anger was there. It had been there for months. It was a banked and steady thing she had carried long enough to understand that expressing it would accomplish nothing. What went quiet was the part of her that still believed the institution would self-correct. That part extinguished cleanly, like a pilot light in a gas line that had been shut off at the source. "Effective immediately," Vale said, closing the folder. "Your employment at Westbrook General is being terminated. Security will assist you in collecting your personal belongings." The room didn't move. 2 of the nurses, Yolanda, a 15-year veteran of the floor, and a younger woman named Bex, who had been there 18 months, looked at each other in a way that wasn't surprise so much as recognition. So it was her. Priya's face was doing something complicated that Claire didn't have time to examine. Donald said flatly, "This is wrong." "Donald, I'm documenting my objection." Vale's jaw tightened by a fraction. "You're welcome to do that." He looked at Claire. "I'll need your badge." She unclipped it. She set it on the table without throwing it, because throwing it would have felt too much like the moment mattering in the way he wanted it to matter, and she refused to give him that. "Your personal effects will be gathered with security present," he said. "That's standard procedure." "I'm aware of your procedures," she said. 2 security officers were already in the hallway. She had not seen them arrive, which meant they had been positioned before the meeting started, which meant the decision had been made before she'd walked into the room. She walked out of Conference Room B with 12 years of clinical experience and 7 years of Army service and a limp that 3 different surgeons had told her would never fully resolve, and she carried those things across the hospital the same way she'd always carried them, without announcement, without asking for accommodation, without breaking stride. The cardboard box took 8 minutes to fill. Her stethoscope, which was her own and not the hospital's. A photograph of a mountain range she'd taped to the inside of her locker 3 years ago from a place she'd been stationed that she didn't have a name she could say out loud. A spare set of compression socks. A paperback novel she'd been reading in 5-minute increments for 4 months and was 60 pages from finishing. She put the box under her arm. She nodded to the security officers. Tomas, who had the look of a man doing a job he found distasteful and was pretending he didn't, and she walked toward the lobby. She was 40 feet from the exit when she heard the doors. Not the automatic lobby doors. The emergency entrance. The sound was wrong. Not the rhythmic whoosh of ambulance bay traffic. Not the specific mechanical signature of a gurney coming through. It was the particular percussion of multiple people moving fast and in coordination, the kind of sound that reads differently when you've heard it in contexts where it preceded violence. And something in her brainstem registered it before her conscious mind caught up. She stopped walking. The security officer beside her stopped too, for a different reason. He'd heard it, but he was filtering it through a civilian interpretation, looking for the most benign explanation. She was not filtering it that way. She turned. 3 men had come through the emergency entrance. They were wearing civilian clothes but moving with military bearing that had been partially suppressed, which made it worse rather than better, like watching something try to disguise itself badly. One of them had his hand at his jacket front in a way that had no innocent interpretation. They weren't patients. They weren't family members of patients. They weren't delivery personnel. The lobby desk attendant, a young woman named Rosa, who was 22 and had been working the front desk for 6 months, was already reaching for her phone in the slow, uncertain way of someone trying to process whether what they were seeing required action. It required action. The lead man scanned the lobby and his eyes settled on the military party, Rear Admiral Declan Marsh and his 2 officers, who had apparently returned to the lobby from wherever they'd gone after the inspection, and were now standing near the elevators with Vale in what looked like a conclusion of visit exchange. The man's hand moved at his jacket. Claire dropped the box. It hit the floor and the contents scattered. Stethoscope, paperback, compression socks, and she was already moving by the time anyone registered the sound, not toward the exit, not toward cover, but toward the lobby desk, toward Rosa. Because Rosa's hand was still reaching for the phone, and Rosa did not understand yet that the correct action was not to call security, but to trigger the emergency lockdown protocol that would seal the building's internal access points. Emergency Protocol 7, Claire said, arriving at the desk. Right now, the red panel. Rosa blinked. The red panel, Claire repeated. Not loud, not panicked, the voice she'd used in operating tents when people were losing blood faster than she could account for, and the most important thing was to sound like the room had a ceiling. Emergency lockdown. Flip the cover and press the button. Do it now. Rosa's hand moved to the red panel. The lockdown alarms, 3 ascending tones, hadn't even finished its first cycle before Claire was already turning back toward the lobby. Rear Admiral Marsh had registered the alarm and turned toward the emergency entrance. He had the look of a man who processed threat information quickly and was in the middle of processing it now. His 2 officers had moved, one flanking left, one stepping in front of him. Good instincts, good training, but wrong geometry for this room. The lead man had cleared his jacket. Claire moved. She crossed the lobby in the particular way she moved in emergencies. Not running, not slow, something in between that looked unhurried from the outside and was not unhurried from the inside. The limp barely visible, because in emergencies her nervous system suspended the compensation pattern and she moved on something closer to muscle memory laid down before the injury existed. She picked up the metal IV stand from the corner of the waiting area, the one that shouldn't have been there, that some orderly had left in the lobby instead of returning it to the floor, and she had noted it this morning when she arrived and filed it as a housekeeping issue to address later. Later was now. The first man saw her coming and made the mistake that people always make with someone who moves like she moves. He assigned her the wrong category, his eyes registering nurse, no threat, and by the time he'd finished the categorization, she was already within his reach, and the IV stand had connected with his forearm in a way that was not technically a strike, and not technically not a strike. And the thing he'd been holding in his jacket hand went skidding across the polished lobby floor toward the far wall. The alarm was still cycling. The second man was moving toward the Admiral. Claire said, without raising her voice, to Rear Admiral Marsh, "Get behind the desk." Marsh looked at her. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second. "Admiral," she said, "now." He moved. The second man reached her just as she turned, and she had the IV stand up, and she was not fighting the way you fight, when you have 2 good legs and full mobility, and she was also not losing, because she had learned a long time ago in conditions considerably worse than a hospital lobby, how to account for the geometry of her own body, how to turn the weight distribution into an asset rather than a liability, how to be in the exact place the other person didn't expect. She put him on the floor. It wasn't clean. Her knees screamed when she came down on it, and she made a sound she hadn't planned to make, and she was already up again before the pain finished registering. The third man was at the emergency entrance doors, which had sealed in the lockdown. He looked at the sealed doors. He looked at the woman in scrubs with a metal stand who had just put his partner on the floor. The lobby alarm cycled again. Somewhere above them, on the floors she could no longer access, the lockdown protocols she had triggered were moving through the building, elevators halting, stairwell doors sealing, the pediatric wing going into the specific isolation protocol that was the most defensible position in the building's layout. She knew that layout. She had learned it, not for this, not for any of this, but because she had learned every layout she'd ever worked in, because that was a habit she'd never been able to turn off, the way some people couldn't stop counting exits when they walked into a room. She stood in the middle of the lobby with her knee on fire and her cardboard box scattered across the floor and her badge on a conference table somewhere behind her, and she looked at Rear Admiral Declan Marsh behind the lobby desk, and Marsh was looking back at her, and his expression had changed in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. "Duval," he said. "Sir?" "What's your call sign?" The question dropped into the sealed lobby like something falling from a great height. Rosa had gone completely still behind the desk. Tomas, the security officer, was flattened against the wall with his radio in his hand, transmitting. The man on the floor was not getting up. The third man had his hands visible. Somewhere outside, she could hear the first signatures of tactical response, the specific frequency of radio communication that preceded a coordinated entry, the sound that in another life had meant relief was 40 seconds out. She straightened. Her knee was still screaming. She didn't show it. "Ghost Raven," she said. Rear Admiral Declan Marsh came to full attention. Both of his officers, without any visible signal between them, did the same. Rosa made a small involuntary sound. Tomas stopped transmitting and stared. The lobby was completely, utterly silent except for the fading last tone of the alarm cycle, and in that silence, every single person in it began to understand that the nurse who had been fired 11 minutes ago and had just put 2 armed men on the floor was something the words nurse and fired had never adequately described. Outside, the tactical teams were 40 seconds out, and somewhere on a conference table, Claire Duval's badge was sitting next to a closed folder that Marcus Vale had prepared very carefully and was about to wish he'd never opened. The tactical teams came through the emergency entrance at 43 seconds, not 40, and Claire noted the 3-second variance the way she noted everything, without commentary, without judgment, filed and stored. 4 officers in full tactical gear, weapons at low ready, sweeping the lobby in the pattern she would have called if she'd been the one calling it. They were good. They were also arriving after the fact, which was the story of tactical response in any environment she'd ever operated in. By the time the cavalry showed up, the people on the ground had already decided how the next 10 minutes were going to go. She had her hands visible before they cleared the doorway. Old habit. The last thing you wanted was to be the unidentified person with a metal object in a room where armed responders were making rapid categorization decisions. "Clear," she said, loud enough to carry. 2 subjects secured, 1 compliant at the east door. No shots fired, no casualties. The lead officer, Sergeant's insignia, Westbrook PD Tactical, moving with the practiced economy of someone who'd done this more than twice, did a fast sweep of the room and then looked at her. "You the one who triggered lockdown?" "Yes." "Anybody else involved?" "Admiral Marsh and his personnel are secure behind the reception desk. The subjects entered through the emergency bay approximately 4 minutes ago. The one on the floor by the elevator took a fall. He'll need medical evaluation." She paused. The weapon he was carrying went toward the north wall. "It hasn't been touched since." The sergeant followed her eyeline to the weapon, then back to her. His expression was doing the same recalibration she'd seen in the Admiral's face earlier. That particular adjustment people made when the information they were receiving didn't match the category they'd assigned. He decided to process it later. Smart. "Ma'am, I need you to stay in this lobby until we've cleared the building." "Understood." He moved. His team moved with him, 1 staying on the 2 subjects, 1 covering the east door, 2 pushing through toward the interior corridors. Behind the reception desk, Rosa was sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinet, knees pulled up, breathing in the shallow, rapid pattern of someone who had processed a great deal of adrenaline in a very short time and was now trying to figure out what to do with it. Claire walked to the desk, slowly, keeping her hands visible until the remaining officer gave her a short nod. She crouched beside Rosa, which her knee registered as a significant objection. "Hey," she said, "you did exactly right." Rosa looked at her. Her eyes were too wide, the whites showing at the edges. I just pressed the button." That's what needed to happen. You pressed the button. I didn't know what was... I didn't understand what was... You don't have to understand it while it's happening, Claire said. You just have to do the next right thing, that's all. She stayed crouched until Rosa's breathing slowed to something closer to functional. Is there water back there? Rosa reached up to the desk surface without looking and found a half-empty water bottle by feel. She handed it to Claire instead of drinking it herself, which was the kind of thing people did when they were running on shock and instinct, and Claire handed it back. Drink it, she said. You earned it. The ghost of something crossed Rosa's face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that direction. Rear Admiral Marsh appeared at the end of the desk. He'd been on a radio. She could see the earpiece now, seated in his left ear, which she hadn't clocked before because she'd been doing other things. He looked at Rosa briefly, then at Claire, and he had the look of a man who was managing several simultaneous priorities and had chosen which one to address first. Can you walk? He asked Claire. Her knee was broadcasting fairly clearly that the answer was complicated. Yes. I need you away from the lobby before the next wave of responders comes through. The building's about to get complicated. She didn't ask what complicated meant. She stood, slowly, controlled, not letting it show, and followed him toward the corridor that led to the hospital's main administrative wing. She had been in the Westbrook General Administrative Wing twice in her 18 months at the hospital. Once for her onboarding orientation, once when HR had called her in about the documentation complaint that had gone nowhere. Both times she'd sat in a chair across from someone with a folder and left with nothing resolved. Marsh took her to the hospital's small boardroom, which was unlocked because hospitals always had rooms that were unlocked during business hours, and nobody thought about it until it mattered. He closed the door. One of his officers, the younger one, Lieutenant someone, she hadn't caught the name, posted outside in the corridor with the particular posture of someone who was preventing entry rather than simply waiting. Marsh sat down across from her without any preliminary. No pleasantries, no stage setting. She appreciated that. How long have you been here? He asked. Westbrook General, 18 months? Undercover? No. She said it cleanly because the distinction mattered. I separated from service. 18 months ago. This is just a job. Something moved through his expression, not disbelief, closer to the look of someone reconciling two pieces of information that hadn't fit until now. Ghost Raven, he said. I haven't used that in a long time. No, you wouldn't. He was quiet for a moment, and she understood that the quiet wasn't uncertainty. He was loading the next thing carefully. I didn't recognize you. I want you to know that. When I saw you this morning, I didn't... I know, she said. 17 months is enough time, and I look different. She didn't mean the limp, though she knew it registered. She meant something less specific and more complete. The particular quality that gets stripped out of a person when the role that organized their identity is removed. She'd seen it in other vets. She'd seen it in the mirror. The men who came in today, she said, they were looking for you. Yes. That's not random. No. She waited. He was a rear admiral, and she was an unemployed nurse, and the power differential was real, but they were also sitting in an unlocked boardroom with a building in lockdown between them and the outside world, and she'd just put two of his would-be assailants on the lobby floor, so the usual social geometry didn't entirely apply. There's an ongoing federal investigation, Marsh said. I'm part of a review board that's been examining procurement irregularities, contracts, defense suppliers. He paused. Someone decided the review board should have fewer members. And they decided that today, here. The inspection was on the public calendar. They knew where I'd be. She turned that over. A public calendar. The inspection, scheduled and published through the hospital's liaison office, had given someone a window, a location, and a time. It was the kind of operational security failure that would have been unacceptable in any context she'd spent her career in, and in a civilian context, it was simply the cost of transparency, and she understood that, but it sat badly. Who else knows the scope of the investigation? She asked. That's a federal question. I'm not asking as a federal question. I'm asking as the person who is in the lobby. He looked at her for a long moment. More people than should. She nodded. She didn't press it. She'd worked in enough environments where information had a tiered architecture to understand when she'd reached the edge of her clearance, even in a conversation without formal clearance parameters. "Your chief administrator," Marsh said. "Vale." She went still. "He called my office last week," Marsh said. "I didn't take the call personally. My aide handled it. He was asking about the inspection, specifically about the itinerary, which floors, which times." The information moved through her carefully, not fast because fast processing of something this significant led to errors. "He got an answer?" she said. "My aide provided the standard public itinerary, but he asked follow-up questions about my personal schedule within the visit, about whether I'd be moving through the hospital independently at any point." She looked at the table surface. She looked at her hands. The knuckles of her right hand were abraded where she'd connected with something in the lobby. She hadn't registered it until now. "You think Vale knew?" she said. "I think it's a question that needs answering. And the timing of my termination." "Yes." She understood what he wasn't saying. She understood it the way she understood most things that weren't said directly, through the architecture of what surrounded the silence. Vale had cleared her from the building before the attack. Whether that was coincidence or calculation was, as Marsh had said, a question that needed answering. But the question had a shape, and the shape was not comfortable. Outside in the corridor, she could hear the building's activity shifting, the particular frequency of multiple agencies arriving, coordinating, the procedural overlay of an incident response moving from the acute phase into the investigative phase. Through the boardroom's single narrow window, she could see the east parking structure, and there were 3 vehicles she hadn't seen there this morning, dark, unmarked, with the kind of plates she recognized. Federal. "You should let me look at your hand," she said. Marsh blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Your hand. Left one. You were holding the desk edge hard enough to—" She gestured. There was a small contusion forming at the base of his palm, the kind you got when you gripped something rigid during an adrenaline spike and your own strength worked against you. He looked at his hand as if he'd forgotten it was attached to him. "Occupational habit," she said. "I notice injuries." He almost did something that might have been a smile under different conditions. "I'm fine." "I know. But in about 20 minutes, your hand is going to remind you that you're not 25 and you should ice it before then." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he hadn't during the inspection, the way nobody at Westbrook had looked at her in 18 months. And she felt the quality of that attention as something different from the scrutiny she was used to, which parsed her for deficits. This was parsing her for something else. "Captain Duvall," he said. "I'm not a captain anymore." "No," he said, "but you moved like one today." She iced his hand with a bag from the boardroom's small refrigerator and a cloth from the hospitality station, which was the kind of improvisation that felt ludicrously mundane against the backdrop of what was happening in the rest of the building, and they were both aware of the absurdity, and neither of them mentioned it. The federal agents came to them. 2 of them, FBI from the look of the credentials, a woman in her late 30s named Special Agent Dara Finch, and a man who introduced himself as Ruiz and didn't elaborate. Finch had the practiced, even-tempo delivery of someone who had conducted a great many interviews and was currently conducting one while appearing not to. Claire gave her account 3 times, not because Finch asked her to repeat herself, but because the 3 accounts addressed 3 different things: the sequence of events in the lobby, her prior knowledge of the building's lockdown protocols, and her employment history at Westbrook General, which Finch had been briefed on in enough detail to ask specific questions about. "You were terminated this morning," Finch said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Before the incident." 11 minutes before. Finch wrote something. "And the grounds for termination, as stated by Administrator Vale. Conduct during the military inspection, and a prior notation about physical capacity, which you disputed through HR channels without resolution." Finch wrote something else. Ruiz was looking at the narrow window with the expression of someone reading a document he hadn't been given. "Nurse Duvall," Finch said, setting her pen down in the way that meant the official portion was concluding, and what came next was different in character. "I need to ask you something that's outside the scope of this morning's incident." "All right." "How well do you know this building?" She considered the question. "Well enough. 18 months on the third floor, but I learned the whole layout during orientation, and I've had reason to be on most floors at some point. Security infrastructure, camera placements, access points, lockdown protocols. I know the lockdown protocols because I've read them. I know the emergency exits because I read those too. Camera placements. I can give you a rough idea for the floors I've worked. Finch looked at Ruiz. Something passed between them. We've been in this building for 40 minutes, Finch said, and we've already found 3 camera blind spots that shouldn't exist, including one in the corridor outside Administrator Vale's office. The information settled into the room. Someone created them, Claire said. Someone created them, Finch confirmed. Deliberately. Over a period of time. She paused. The 3 men from this morning didn't walk into this building blind. They knew which entrance to use, they knew the camera coverage, and they knew where Admiral Marsh would be in the building at 2:15. Claire's jaw tightened. The internal inspection calendar, she said. The one Vale would have had access to. Yes. She looked at her abraded knuckles. She thought about the folder Vale had closed on the conference table. She thought about HR and the documentation prepared in advance, the security officers already in the hallway before the meeting had concluded, the meticulous assembly of reasons that had nothing to do with anything she had actually done wrong. She thought about the way he had timed it, cleared her out, made sure she was in the lobby, headed for the exit. He needed me out of the building, she said, not to Finch, not quite to anyone. Not because of the inspection, because he didn't know what I was, and he couldn't afford an unknown in the building during... She stopped. Finch was watching her. He didn't know about my service record, Claire said slowly, but he knew I was a variable he couldn't calculate. 18 months, and I never talked about my background. Never gave anyone anything to categorize, and that made me a liability, Finch said. A problem. Finch picked up her pen again. We're going to need you to stay available for the next several days. We may need to walk the building with you. I'm unemployed as of this morning, Claire said. I have availability. It came out flat, not bitter, just accurate. Finch had the grace not to respond to it with sympathy. Outside, the late afternoon light was hitting the parking structure at an angle that turned the concrete orange gold, and somewhere in the building above them, Claire knew that the patients on the third floor had been in lockdown for nearly 2 hours, that the IV pump on Bay 4 was probably throwing errors again, that Gerald's arm needed to stay elevated and nobody had checked on him since before the meeting in Conference Room B. She thought about that. She thought about the 62-year-old woman in room 314 with the elevated temperature and the guarding pattern that the attending hadn't reviewed yet. And she felt the particular specific helplessness of being a clinician locked out of a clinical space, the way a pilot might feel watching a plane she knew from the outside. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, local area code, text message. We know what you are, Ghost Raven. So does Vale. You were never supposed to walk out of that building. She read it twice. She looked up at Finch. Agent Finch, she said, holding the phone out. I think you need to see this. Finch took the phone, read it. Her expression didn't change, but her hand went to her radio. Ruiz, she said. Yeah. We have a second problem. Ruiz was on his radio before Finch finished the sentence. The sequence that followed had the compressed, overlapping quality of professional response. Not chaos, but density. Multiple things happening in the same 30 seconds that would take several minutes to untangle later. Finch was calling in the number. Ruiz was stepping into the corridor to coordinate with the tactical team still working the building's upper floors. The boardroom, which had been a quiet administrative space 12 minutes ago, was now a secondary command node in an active federal operation, and Claire sat in the middle of it and did the things she had learned to do in environments like this. She went still, conserved energy, and processed. The text had come from a local number. Burner, almost certainly. The kind of prepaid device you could buy at any gas station and activate without ID, untraceable in any meaningful time frame. Which meant whoever sent it either didn't care about being traced or had already moved past caring, because the message itself was the point. Not information. Pressure. We know what you are, Ghost Raven. Someone outside the federal investigation knew her call sign. That narrowed the field in ways that were uncomfortable to examine. Her service record was classified at a level that required specific clearance to access. Not impenetrable, but not casually available either. The people who knew Ghost Raven as more than a name could be counted in a relatively small group. Her chain of command during the years she'd been active, the personnel who'd worked the specific operations where that name had meant something operational, and the administrative tier that managed classified personnel records. She turned the phone over in her hands and thought about Vale calling Marsh's office, about the camera blind spots that had been created deliberately over time, about the fact that the three men this morning hadn't come in shooting. They'd come in quiet, controlled, dressed to blend until they didn't need to anymore, which was the profile of a targeted extraction rather than a general attack. They weren't there to create an incident. They were there to remove one person from a building with minimum observable disruption, which meant the plan had not included her being in the lobby at all. She had been supposed to be gone. Finch came back into the boardroom and sat down across from her without preamble. The number is a prepaid registered 2 days ago. We're working on cell tower data, but it'll take time. She set a tablet on the table between them. I need to show you something. The tablet displayed a personnel file, hers, or rather, a version of it. She recognized the Army's document formatting, the header structure, but the fields that should have contained the classified portion of her service history were intact, fully intact, unredacted. She looked at Finch. Where did you get this? It was in Vale's office, on his personal laptop, not the hospital's network. Finch watched her face carefully. It was accessed 3 days ago, before the inspection was ever public knowledge. Claire looked at the document. Her own face looked back at her from the photo in the upper left corner. Younger by 8 years, in uniform. The photograph taken during a promotion ceremony she barely remembered, because there had been an operational brief 2 hours later that had consumed everything else about that day. He knew, she said. He knew, Finch confirmed. And he still fired you. He fired me to get me out of the building without triggering any of the protocols I would have triggered if I'd seen what was coming. She heard her own voice processing it, even as she spoke. He knew exactly what I was capable of, and that was the problem, not my documentation or my... She stopped. The leg pain that had been a steady background present since the lobby was climbing towards something more insistent, and she recognized the specific quality of it, the joint protest that came after extended stress on tissue that had been repaired but not restored. She shifted her weight, and the pain spiked cleanly, and she absorbed it without expression because there were more important things in the room. Where's Vale now? She asked. Building's in lockdown. He's on the second floor in his office. Finch paused. He's been there since the incident. Hasn't asked about the patients. Hasn't asked about the tactical response. He called his personal attorney 40 minutes ago. 40 minutes ago is when the tactical team would have cleared his floor, Claire said. Yes. He waited until the guns were gone. Yes. She thought about the 62-year-old woman in room 314, the elevated temperature, the guarding pattern. In a building lockdown, attending rounds would have been suspended, which meant the flag she'd put in the system this morning was sitting in a queue nobody was actively monitoring. The patients, she said, medical staff have been cleared to operate within their locked zones. The third-floor team has been authorized to continue care. I had a patient flagged for potential surgical site infection, room 314. The flag was in the system before the lockdown. She gave Finch the clinical summary in 40 words. I need someone to confirm the attending has actually reviewed it, not just that the system shows the flag is pending. Finch's expression shifted fractionally. Not dismissal, more like someone recalibrating which category of person they were dealing with. Because the person they'd initially categorized would not have been tracking room 314 through a federal incident interview. She reached for her radio. I'll get someone to check. Thank you. Don't thank me. I need you functional for the next several hours and worried about your patients as a distraction. It was practical rather than kind, which Claire respected more anyway. Marsh came back into the boardroom 20 minutes later. The ice bag had been replaced with a proper cold pack from the medical kit one of the tactical officers had brought in, and he was holding it against his palm with the resigned expression of a man accepting that his body had opinions he hadn't solicited. He sat down at the head of the table rather than across from her, which shifted the geometry of the room slightly. More collaborative, less interrogative. Federal building security has been notified, he said. The 3 individuals from the lobby have been transported and are in federal custody. The one you put down is being evaluated at Eastview Medical. He paused. Mild concussion and a fractured radius. I didn't intend the radius, she said. I know. The floor did that. He looked at her steadily. Agent Finch has briefed me on Vale's file. And I owe you an apology. He said it flatly, without the performative weight that apologies sometimes carried when they were really about the person giving them. My office should not have answered those questions. My aide provided information that was used in a coordinated attack on a federal official, and that happened because we don't run our liaison visits with adequate operational security, and that's a failure I own. She didn't tell him it was all right, because it wasn't all right. She said, What happens to the investigation now? It continues. Today accelerated certain aspects of it. He set the cold pack down. The 3 men from this morning aren't the principals. They're contracted, which means there are people above them who arranged this, and those people are now aware the operation failed and that we have 3 contractors in federal custody. Which means they're moving, she said. Quickly. She understood the operational clock that implied. People who arranged things like this morning had contingency plans. And the first contingency when a field operation failed was to create distance between themselves and the failure, which meant destroying evidence, relocating assets, and if necessary, removing the people who could connect them to what had happened. Vale, she said. He's a connection, Marsh said, but he may also be a target now. She hadn't considered that angle, and she considered it now. Vale had accessed her classified file and provided operational information about Marsh's itinerary, which made him complicit in what had happened this morning. The people who'd arranged the morning also knew that. And a complicit civilian in a locked building surrounded by federal agents was a liability those people could not afford. He needs to be moved, she said. Out of the building. Marsh was already nodding. Finch has him flagged. Not flagged. Moved. Right now, not when... Her phone buzzed again. Different number this time. Local. Different area code prefix. 3 minutes. North stairwell, VIP suite floor. She showed Marsh. His face changed. That's the floor Vale is on, he said. She was already standing. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not smooth. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in her own mind, because the version of events that would be written into reports later would have the particular ordered quality of retrospective narrative, and the actual experience was nothing like that. Finch's radio had a 30-second delay in reaching the officer posted on the 2nd floor because the building's interior communication infrastructure was running on emergency backup, and the backup was routing everything through a single relay that was slightly overwhelmed. 30 seconds is long enough for a great many things to happen. She took the north stairwell because it was the closest access point and because the text had specified it, which meant the north stairwell was either the threat vector or it was bait, and she needed to know which before Finch's officer arrived on the 2nd floor alone. Marsh came with her. She didn't argue about it because she didn't have time to argue about it, and because he was, despite the cold pack and the years since he'd been in a field role, clearly still someone who moved through a threat environment with the kind of economy that wasn't trained in boardrooms. Her knee was not happy with the stairs. She noted it and kept moving. The north stairwell was a concrete shaft, the fire stairs, with metal railings and the particular acoustic quality of enclosed vertical space. Sounds traveled up and down it with more clarity than the corridors. She heard it before she saw it. 2 sets of footsteps, one below her, one above, converging on the 2nd floor landing from opposite directions. She stopped on the 2nd floor door, held up a fist. Marsh stopped. She listened. One set of footsteps resolved into a single person, moving fast, not tactical, civilian pace, the footfall of someone under stress, uneven rhythm, slightly too heavy on the right foot. The other set had stopped, which was worse because controlled stillness was a choice, and choices implied purpose. She pushed the door open. The 2nd floor corridor was the administrative wing, carpet instead of tile, lower ceilings, office doors on both sides, quieter than the clinical floors. Vale was 20 feet down the corridor, moving away from her toward the elevators, which were locked in the building's emergency protocol and would not open a fact he either didn't know or wasn't thinking about clearly. He heard the door and turned. For a full second, he stared at her. Whatever he'd expected to come through that stairwell door, it wasn't her. "Get back," she said, not loud, controlled. "Back toward me. Now." "You don't—" He stopped. He was breathing hard, jacket gone, shirt untucked. The polished administrative persona she'd spent 18 months watching him deploy, now completely dissolved. He looked the way people looked when they realized that the systems they'd operated inside had failed to protect them. "I got a call. They said I needed to—" "I know. Don't go toward the elevators. Come back toward me." He didn't move. Fear had made him rigid in the way that fear sometimes did, turning the body into an obstacle to its own survival. Marcus. She said his name for the first time, and it landed differently than anything else she'd said in the corridor. "Walk toward me." He took 2 steps. The door at the far end of the corridor, the south stairwell, the other access point she hadn't been able to cover, opened. The person who came through it was not someone she recognized. Male, mid-40s, civilian clothes, moving with the suppressed military bearing she'd clocked in the lobby this morning, and he was looking at Vale, not at her, which told her exactly what she'd suspected about Vale's current position in someone else's risk assessment. He saw her. She had the fire extinguisher off the wall bracket before the calculation in his eyes had finished running. Not because she'd planned it. She'd noted the bracket when she came through the door the same way she noted all brackets and all shelving and all loose equipment in all spaces she moved through. 18 years of ingrained habit, and the body retrieved it faster than the conscious mind called for it. She threw it. Not at him. At the floor in front of him, a heavy canister hitting carpet and bouncing at an angle that disrupted his footing, and in the half-second of disruption she moved. Her knee sent a clear message about its capacity for this kind of thing. She filed the message and moved anyway. He was better trained than the lobby team. She registered that in the first exchange, faster response time, better weight distribution, the kind of hand placement that came from a specific combative's background she could partially identify by the geometry. She was also a full foot shorter, working with a compromised leg, and she had not slept well in 3 days because she'd been picking up extra shifts to cover the gap that the staffing shortage left. She was also angry, which was not a tactical asset she'd ever been taught to rely on, but which had the practical effect of narrowing her focus down to a very clean point. He got his hands on her left arm, or left. She went with the direction instead of against it, an old reflex, efficient on good days, occasionally wrong. And she used the momentum to take him into the wall at an angle that put the wall's work against his shoulder joint, rather than against her own diminishing leverage. He made a sound. She didn't stop. The second point of contact put him down in a way that was not clean and not controlled, and left her with her own shoulder screaming in addition to her knee, both of them on the floor of a carpeted administrative corridor with a fire extinguisher rolling into the baseboard 8 feet away. He did not get up. She did. Slowly. More slowly than she would have preferred. Marsh was beside Vale, hand on his arm, moving him back toward the north stairwell door where Finch's officer was now visible, arriving at a run from somewhere behind them. She stood in the corridor and breathed and catalogued the damage. Shoulder joint, probably a partial strain rather than a tear. 2 to 3 weeks if she was careful. 4 if she wasn't. Knee? Aggravated. The swelling she'd been managing since morning now passed the point where compression socks were adequate. She'd need imaging. She wouldn't get it today. The officer reached the downed man and called in the situation, and the corridor filled with the back and forth of radio traffic. And somewhere in the middle of it, Vale said something she wasn't tracking because her attention had snagged on something else. The door at the end of the corridor, the south stairwell, was still open, and there was a laptop visible inside Vale's office, through the open door to her left, screen on, active. She walked to it. She didn't touch it. Federal evidence, she understood the protocol, but she stood in the doorway and looked at the screen, and what she saw on the screen was not a personnel file, and not an email, and not a calendar. It was a secure chat window, active within the last 6 minutes, and the most recent message in the thread was 3 words. Abort. She's there. Beneath that, a username she didn't recognize, and a string of characters that meant nothing to her on their own. But at the top of the chat window, in the small identifier field that showed the thread's origin point, was a domain suffix she did recognize. It wasn't a personal account. It wasn't a commercial platform. It was a government domain. She stood in the doorway of Vale's office and looked at a secure government chat thread that someone inside a federal or military system had been using to coordinate an attack on a rear admiral, and she felt the specific chill of understanding that what she'd walked into this morning was not a local corruption problem or a hospital administrator with misplaced loyalties. It went up. She didn't know how far, but it went up considerably further than Marcus Vale, and Marcus Vale had known it, and he had made decisions based on that knowledge that had seemed, from inside the system that was protecting him, to carry no risk. "Finch?" she called. Finch appeared at the corridor doorway within seconds, moving fast. "Don't touch anything in this room," Claire said. "And you need your digital forensics team in here before anyone else goes near that laptop." Finch looked at the screen. Claire watched her read it, watched her jaw set. "How long has it been active?" Finch asked. "The last message is 6 minutes old, which means whoever is on the other end of that thread knows we're here." "Yes." Finch reached for her radio. "I need cyber on the second floor right now, and I need—" She paused, spoke to Claire directly. "I need you to tell me every person at this hospital who had any interaction with Vale's office in the last 2 weeks. Maintenance, cleaning staff, IT, anyone who was in or near this room." "I can give you some of that," Claire said. "Not all." "Give me what you have." "There was an IT contractor on this floor 8 days ago. I noticed because they were here during a staffing meeting and they had access to the administrative server room, which is 3 doors down. She'd noticed because an unfamiliar person with equipment bags in an administrative corridor during a scheduled staff meeting was the kind of detail that didn't fit the pattern of the environment and pattern. Incongruence was something she didn't stop noticing just because she was no longer in a role where noticing it was professionally required. Finch wrote it down. What did they look like? Claire described them. Male, approximately 35, a specific height she'd clocked relative to the doorframe, a jacket with a logo she'd partially read as some kind of network services company carrying a black Pelican case and a soft bag with cable loops visible at the top. Finch was writing. "You got all that from a hallway pass?" "I have a problem with standing still," Claire said. "I pay attention to things." The digital forensics agent arrived 3 minutes later, went directly to the laptop, and within 90 seconds said something quietly to Finch that Claire couldn't hear from the doorway. Finch looked up. "It's not just a chat thread," she said. "There are files, a lot of files." She looked at Claire with an expression that was not quite readable, somewhere between professional assessment and something more complicated. "Procurement records, contract awards, personnel transfer requests." She paused. "Including a transfer request for Admiral Marsh, dated 4 months ago, denied at the level above him." Another pause. "And a second one, dated 6 days ago." Claire processed that. "Someone's been trying to move him," she said, "relocate him away from the review board. And when the transfer request failed," Finch said, "someone arranged a site visit with a public itinerary." The corridor was quiet except for the radio traffic and the forensics agent's equipment initializing. Marsh was at the other end of the hallway, one hand on the wall, the cold pack forgotten somewhere, looking at nothing with the expression of a man revising his understanding of how long he'd been in someone's crosshairs. Vale was sitting on the floor near the north stairwell door, with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up and his attorney's phone number in his hand, having not yet been able to call it because his hand was shaking too badly to dial correctly, and he was looking at Claire with an expression she couldn't name, the specific look of a person seeing, too late, the full dimensions of what they had involved themselves in. She met his eyes. She held them for a moment. Then she turned away because there was nothing to say to him that the next several months wouldn't say more efficiently, and because she could hear from the stairwell behind the now closed north door the sound of additional federal personnel arriving. More agents, more equipment, the procedural weight of an investigation that had just become something considerably larger than a morning incident in a hospital lobby. Her phone buzzed a third time. She looked at it. Same unknown number as the second message. "You found the files." "Smart, but you don't know what you're standing in the middle of yet. There's a name in those records you're going to recognize. When you see it, remember, we warned you." She read it twice. Then she looked at the laptop on Vale's desk, at the forensics agent working through the files, and she thought about the transfer requests and the procurement records, and the government domain in the chat thread, and she waited for the name she hadn't seen yet to surface from somewhere in the architecture of whatever this was. She didn't have to wait long. The forensics agent said, "Agent Finch, you're going to want to look at this personnel record." Finch moved to the laptop, stopped, read something, turned around. She was looking at Claire with an expression that was not professional assessment and not complicated and was instead very simple and very specific. "Duval," she said, "how well did you know your commanding officer from Operation Black Summit?" Claire went very still. "Colonel Harlan Voss," Finch said. "He's listed as an active consultant on 3 of the procurement contracts in these files, contracts that total $62 million over 4 years." She turned the laptop so Claire could see the screen from the doorway. "And his signature is on the second transfer request for Admiral Marsh." The name hit her the way the floor hit someone falling, not the impact itself, but the moment before it, when the body understood what was coming and couldn't stop it. Harlan Voss, her CO for the last 3 years of her service, the man who had signed her commendation for Operation Black Summit, the man who had processed her medical separation with what she'd understood at the time to be genuine regret, the man who apparently had known exactly where she was for 18 months. The thing about recognizing a name you trusted was that the recognition and the betrayal arrived simultaneously, packaged together, no gap between them to absorb either one separately. Claire stood in the doorway of Vale's office and looked at Harlan Voss's signature on the transfer request and felt the ground reorganize itself under 18 months of memory. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in the movies, with a rush of recalled images and a sudden reframing of everything that had come before. It was quieter and more specific than that. A series of small recalibrations, each one arriving in sequence, each one slightly worse than the last. Voss had signed her out of the Army with a handshake and a commendation that called her one of the finest combat trauma officers he'd served alongside. He had walked her to her car in the base parking lot on the last day and said, "Don't disappear on us entirely," and she had understood it as the kind of thing commanding officers said when they meant something and couldn't find a more precise way to say it. She understood it differently now. "Don't disappear on us entirely" was not sentiment, it was tracking. "Duval?" Finch's voice was careful, the kind of careful that was itself information. "I need to know what your exposure to Voss was during Black Summit." She pulled herself back into the room. Not physically, she hadn't moved from the doorway, but she pulled her attention back to the present tense, which was a skill she'd had to learn twice. Once in the field, when the past could get you killed, and once after the field, when the past was the only place her mind wanted to live. "He ran the operational tier," she said. "I was medical command for the joint team. We had approximately 9 months of direct interface, briefings, operational planning, post-mission reviews. I didn't have visibility into his administrative or financial functions. Did he have visibility into yours? My medical records? No, my personnel file." She stopped. "He was 2 levels above me. He would have had access to my file." "Including the classified portion." "Including the classified portion." Finch turned back to the laptop. The forensics agent was pulling files methodically, logging each one, and the stack of what had been retrieved was already substantial. Procurement contracts, internal communications, transfer requests not just for Marsh but for 3 other members of the review board, going back 14 months, all of them denied at a level above Voss, which meant that someone above Voss had been holding the investigation together against pressure from below. And whoever that person was had either not known about the morning's events yet or was in the process of learning about them. "The review board," Claire said. "Who authorized it?" Finch didn't answer immediately. "Finch. That information is—" "I'm standing in the middle of a building that someone tried to use as a kill site for a rear admiral," Claire said, "using information that my former commanding officer provided, and someone sent a text message to my personal phone using my classified call sign. So the information is what?" A pause. Finch made a judgment call the way competent people made judgment calls, under pressure, not comfortably, but decisively. "Deputy Inspector General's office," she said. "The review board was authorized by the DIG's office. 14 months ago. Admiral Marsh was appointed to chair it 9 months in, after the original chair was transferred. She paused. The transfer request on the original chair was also in Voss's handwriting. Claire processed that. 9 months. Marsh had been running the review board for 9 months, which was roughly the period during which someone had decided that transfer requests weren't working and had moved to a more direct approach. How many people know the full scope of what's in those files? She asked. As of right now? Finch looked at the forensics agent. 4 people in this building. You're one of them. Then you need to control that room completely until your cyber team has a secure copy, and you need someone on Vale right now who isn't a local officer, because local is an unknown at this point. Already moving on both. Finch looked at her steadily. You should know. The first text you received. The Ghost Raven message. We ran the cell data and the phone pinged a tower 4 blocks from this hospital. 4 blocks. Someone was here, Claire said. Someone was here before the incident. We think they left during the confusion of the initial tactical response. Finch's expression was neutral, but her eyes weren't. That person knew your call sign, knew your location, and timed the message for the exact window between your termination and your departure from the building, which meant they had known she was being fired, which meant the termination had been communicated to someone outside the hospital before it happened, which meant Vale's involvement went further than accessing a personnel file and answering questions about a visitor's itinerary. He was coordinating, she said, actively. Yes. Down the hall, Vale made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, the kind that precedes breaking down entirely. And Claire looked at him briefly and then looked away because she didn't have the bandwidth for it, and because what she felt about him was not simple enough to be useful right now. Well, the lockdown lifted from the clinical floors at 4:47 in the afternoon. Not completely. The administrative wing and the lobby remained sealed and would stay that way through the evening, but the clinical floors reopened to internal movement, which meant nurses could move between units, which meant the patients who had been in various states of confusion and anxiety for the past several hours could finally receive proper communication about what had happened. Claire went back to the 3rd floor. Nobody stopped her. She no longer had a badge, but Marsh had spoken to the tactical team lead, and the tactical team lead had communicated something to the floor officers. And when she came through the stairwell door onto the 3rd floor, the 2 officers posted there looked at her and stepped aside. Priya was at the nurse's station. She looked up when Claire came through, and her expression went through several distinct phases in about 2 seconds. Relief, confusion, something complicated in between. You came back, Priya said. Someone had to check on 314. I checked. Attending reviewed the flag at 4:15. They're moving her to a monitored room and starting a culture panel. Priya paused. I documented it the way you would have. Good. She stood at the nurse's station for a moment, gripping the edge of the counter because her knee had used up its last cooperative reserve somewhere on the 2nd floor and was now insisting on being the primary item of her attention. The station was familiar. The monitors, the medication carts, the specific quality of light in the late afternoon, the sound profile of the floor in transition between afternoon and evening shift. She had spent more hours in this space than in any other space in Westbrook, and standing in it without a badge was a specific strangeness she didn't have a clean way to process. What actually happened? Priya asked quietly. Down there. What was it? It was a lot of things that had been building for a long time, Claire said, which was true and complete, and also the version of the answer she could give in a nurse's station on a clinical floor to someone who deserved more than she could provide right now. Priya looked at her for a long moment. Donald is filing a formal HR complaint about your termination. He documented his objection during the meeting, and he's submitting everything tonight. Tell him to hold it, Claire said. For now. Tell him the federal investigation takes precedence, and any HR filings should wait for guidance from the FBI liaison. Priya's eyebrows went up by a fraction. The FBI liaison. There will be one assigned by tomorrow morning. Claire. Priya dropped her voice further, though there was nobody in earshot. Who are you? It was asked simply, without accusation, the genuine question of someone who had worked alongside a person for 18 months and was now recalculating the dimensions of what they'd known. I'm the nurse who fixed the IV pump on Bay 4 this morning, Claire said. That part hasn't changed. Priya absorbed this. She was a person who knew when an answer was the whole answer and when it was the portion of the answer that was available, and she was smart enough to accept the distinction. Gerald asked about you, she said. He heard the alarm and asked one of the floor officers if the nurse with the limp was okay. Claire felt something shift slightly in her chest. Not sentiment exactly. More like the specific weight of being known by a 67-year-old post-surgical patient who'd spent approximately 4 collective minutes talking to her and had chosen, in a moment of building-wide crisis, to ask after her specifically. Tell him I'm fine, she said. And tell him his arm needs to stay elevated. She left the 3rd floor and went back to the administrative wing because there was still work to do, and she was apparently the only person in the building who knew where some of it was located. The federal investigation team expanded over the next 3 hours in the specific way that federal operations expanded when initial findings exceeded initial scope. More agents, more equipment, a mobile command unit that appeared in the east parking structure at 6:15 and turned the administrative wing into something that resembled, in its controlled density of personnel and technical equipment, a forward operating base more than a hospital administrative zone. Claire spent 2 hours with Finch and a second agent named Torres walking the building's camera infrastructure. This was Torres's specialization: network security, surveillance systems, the architecture of how a building's visual coverage was designed and how it could be compromised. She walked with them because she knew the layout and because she'd been mentally cataloging the camera positions since her second week at Westbrook, not for any purpose she could have named at the time, just because she did that. And doing it turned out to have a specific value she hadn't anticipated. 3 deliberate blind spots. Torres confirmed all of them within 40 minutes. Not equipment failure, not installation error. Targeted signal interruption, introduced at the network level, consistent with access to the hospital's IT infrastructure, which led directly back to the IT contractor on the 2nd floor 8 days ago, who Torres confirmed within another 20 minutes had used credentials registered to a legitimate network services company that, when Torres ran the company registration, had been incorporated 14 months ago in a state where corporate registration required minimal documentation. 14 months, Claire said. Consistent with the review board authorization timeline, Torres said, not looking up from his equipment. The shell company had been created at approximately the same time the review board had begun its work, which meant someone had been planning for the possibility of this building, this specific federal official, the specific window of vulnerability, for over a year. The morning's events had not been reactive. They had been the latest phase of something patient and deliberate. That kind of patience implied resources. It implied protection. It implied that the people behind it had access to information about the investigation's progress in something close to real time, which meant there was a leak inside the review board's operational structure that went beyond Voss. She said as much to Finch when they regrouped in the mobile command unit at 7:30. Finch nodded slowly. We've been running on that assumption since the second transfer request. The board has 8 members. Marsh chairs it. 3 have been targeted for transfer. The other 4... She stopped. Are unknowns, Claire said. Are unknowns, Finch confirmed. Any of them could be information sources. None of them have been briefed on what we found today. Marsh needs to know that. Marsh is being briefed right now. Finch rubbed her eyes with the heels of both hands, a rare display of the fatigue she'd been operating through for the past several hours. There's also the question of Voss's current location. Claire had been waiting for this. He's not in custody, she said. It wasn't a question. His last known location is his home address, which is a 40-minute drive from here. We had agents there at 5:30. He was gone. Neighbors say a car left approximately 90 minutes before agents arrived, which put his departure at approximately 4 o'clock, which was approximately 40 minutes after Finch had spoken Voss's name in Vale's office doorway, which meant... The room wasn't clean, Claire said. Finch went still. When you said his name, Vale's office, Claire turned toward Torres. You swept it for active listening devices? Torres's expression shifted. We swept for standard frequency ranges. What's your non-standard range capability? He looked at Finch. Finch looked at him. "Run it again," Finch said. "Full spectrum." Torres was already moving. They found it in 11 minutes. A device embedded behind the wall plate of the office's electrical outlet. The kind of installation that required maybe 20 minutes of access and left no visible trace. Frequency range outside standard sweep parameters. Voice activated, transmitting in bursts to a receiver that could be anywhere within 3 miles. Every conversation in that office for the past 8 days had been received somewhere else, including the conversation in which Finch had said Harlan Voss's name, including the conversation in which Claire had described the IT contractor's appearance, the jacket logo, the Pelican case, including everything. Finch stood in Vale's office doorway and looked at the device in Torres's evidence bag and did not say anything for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, quietly and with precision, several things that Claire had heard before in military environments and which she found, in this context, entirely appropriate. The notification went out to all agencies at 8:14. Colonel Harlan Voss, retired, active federal contractor, suspect in an ongoing criminal investigation, last known location Westbrook metropolitan area. The language was formal and specific in the way that federal notifications were, and beneath the formal language was the operational reality that a man who had spent 31 years learning how systems worked and how to move through them undetected was currently somewhere within a 3-mile radius, with the knowledge that he'd been identified in approximately 3 hours of head start. Marsh came to find her at 8:40. She was in the break room on the administrative floor, which had been cleared and converted into a kind of informal staging area. Coffee that had been made at some point, and was now substantially past optimal, folding chairs, a table with equipment cases stacked under it. She had her leg extended on a second chair, and she was icing her knee with a cold pack from the medical kit because the swelling had progressed to the point where ignoring it was no longer physiologically responsible. He sat across from her without comment on the cold pack. "Tell me about Voss," he said. "Not his file. Tell me about him." She considered how to answer that. The honest answer required some assembly. "He was effective," she said. "He ran Black Summit with minimal losses in conditions that were producing maximum losses in parallel operations. He made decisions quickly, and he was usually right. And when he was wrong, he absorbed the consequences without transferring them to the people below him." She looked at the cold pack. "That last part was what I respected most. I've worked under people who redirected blame downward as a reflex. Voss didn't do that." "Until now," Marsh said. "He redirected blame downward for 9 years after he left command," she said. "It just took longer to become visible." "Was there anything—" Marsh stopped, started again. "In your time working with him, anything that should have told you this was possible?" She thought about that seriously because it deserved to be thought about seriously. "He cared about outcomes in a way that could detach from the means," she said finally. "At the time I read that as operational pragmatism, which it was. It's also the thing that makes a certain kind of corruption possible. If the outcome is important enough, the means become negotiable." She paused. "I didn't see it because I wasn't looking for it. I was looking at what he did well, which was considerable." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "He recommended you for Black Summit?" "Yes." "And he recommended you for the commendation afterward?" "Yes." "Do you think he regretted that, bringing you in that close?" She had not asked herself that question until this moment, and she found, examining it now, that she didn't have a clean answer. "I think he trusted me when he brought me in," she said. "I think somewhere in the 9 years after Black Summit, his calculation of what I represented changed, and I think the fact that I left the Army and disappeared into a civilian hospital probably read to him as exactly the kind of manageable variable that it seemed to be. Until this morning." "Until this morning." Marsh leaned back in his chair. He looked tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been managing a sustained high-stakes situation for a full day and was now in the metabolic trough that followed. "The review board is suspended pending a leak assessment," he said. "Digi's office is taking direct control of the investigation files. We're running member profiles on all 8 board members." He paused. I need to testify in front of an emergency DIG panel on Friday. 2 days. Yes. Can the case hold without the contractor files from Voss's period of service? If he's destroyed his personal copies, the files in Vale's system are sufficient for the primary fraud case, Marsh said. Voss's involvement is a separate criminal matter. The contractor files help establish duration and pattern, but the core case doesn't depend on them. She nodded. That was something. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it reflexively, then stopped. The previous 2 unknown number messages had reprogrammed her relationship with her own phone in the course of a single day, which was one of the quieter indignities of the situation. This was not an unknown number. It was Priya. Donald submitted the complaint anyway. He said you'd tell him to wait, and he disagreed. HR has it. 12 other staff members signed it. She looked at the message for a moment. Donald, who had said this is wrong in conference room B, and had been told he was welcome to document his objection. Donald, who had 11 years at this hospital and had apparently decided that waiting for federal guidance was not the appropriate pace for basic institutional accountability. She showed the message to Marsh without comment. He read it. 12 staff members. 13 including Donald. That's most of your floor. All of my floor, she said, plus 2 from the second floor from the message count. Marsh looked at the message, and then at her, and then he did something she hadn't seen from him in the entire day. He smiled, briefly, the kind of smile that arrived without permission. What do you want to do about it? He asked. Nothing, she said. Donald made his own decision. It's the right decision. I don't need to manage it. Voss was located at 951, not by the federal agents conducting the active search, by a toll booth camera on the highway 42 miles west of Westbrook, which logged his vehicle's license plate at 8:57, which put him well outside the 3-mile search radius by the time the device in Vale's office had been discovered. He had moved immediately, and he had moved in the right direction for someone trying to put distance between himself and an active federal investigation, and he had another vehicle waiting somewhere because the plate that the toll camera logged matched a rental that was found abandoned at a commuter parking lot at 9:03, and after that the trail ended for the night. Finch told her at 10:15 in the break room with the particular toneless delivery of someone communicating bad news that was not entirely unexpected. He has resources, Claire said. Clearly. And he has time. And he knows what federal manhunts look like from the inside because he spent 3 decades operating adjacent to them. She paused. He'll have a plan. He didn't start moving tonight on a plan he made tonight. No, Finch said. He didn't. How long? Before we locate him. Finch's expression was honest in the way that competent people were honest about things they couldn't control. I don't know, days, weeks, possibly. Depends on his resources and how far ahead he planned. Claire sat with that. Weeks felt wrong. Not because she doubted Finch's assessment, but because Voss's operating profile, the thing she'd described to Marsh an hour ago, didn't align with an extended flight. He was a man who managed situations. Running was not management. He's not running, she said. Finch looked at her. He's repositioning, Claire said. There's a difference. Running is reactive. You put distance between yourself and the threat, and you keep going. Repositioning is strategic. You move to a location where you have operational advantage, and you reassess. She thought about 31 years of military career, the specific pattern of a person who built contingency plans into contingency plans. He has something else. Another option. Something he was holding in reserve if this phase failed. What makes you think it's a reserve option rather than a flight plan? Because the text messages weren't from someone running, she said. They were from someone who was still managing the situation, someone who thought they could still influence the outcome. She looked at the phone on the table in front of her. He sent those, Finch, or he had someone send them on his behalf. And the last one, when you see the name, remember we warned you. That's not the message of someone who's given up the field. That's someone who thinks there's still a play to be made. Finch was quiet. He warned me, Claire continued. That was real. He doesn't want me, specifically, personally, as a casualty. Which means there's something about having me as a casualty that would cost him more than it would cost me. She stopped. What's in those files that I haven't seen yet? There's a section we haven't fully processed, Torres said from across the room, not looking up from his equipment. Financial records, transfer histories, some of it is in a partition we're still working through. How long? Another hour, maybe more. What's in the partition? Personnel records primarily. Redacted at source, meaning whoever put them in Vale's system redacted them before storage, which suggests they were sourced from somewhere with active security protocols. Active security protocols. Military personnel records, then. Classified tier. Pull anything with my name in it first, she said. Torres looked at Finch. Finch nodded. It took 22 minutes. When Torres pulled it up, he turned his screen toward her without comment, which was its own kind of comment. It was a service record summary. Hers. The classified portion, unredacted, which she'd already known Voss had accessed. But beneath the service summary was a separate document, not a personnel file, an evaluation. Written 14 months ago, under the DIG office's review board authorization. She read it in 40 seconds. It was an assessment of personnel who had operational knowledge of Black Summit, a risk evaluation. Who they were, where they were, what they knew, and what they represented to the investigation's security if the investigation were to expand into the operational tier of the period she'd worked under Voss. Her name was third on the list. Beside her name, in the assessment's recommendation column, was a single word: monitor. 14 months ago, someone in or adjacent to the DIG's review board process had flagged her as a risk to the investigation's security and recommended she be kept under observation. Someone who had access to the board's internal documents. Someone who had used that access to protect Voss's position rather than expose it. Which meant the leak wasn't just in the review board. The leak was in the DIG's office itself. And whoever had written the word monitor beside her name 14 months ago had been watching her for 14 months, which meant they had known about Westbrook General, they had known about her employment, they had known, possibly, about this morning before it happened. She looked at the document. She looked at the signature line at the bottom of the evaluation, which she hadn't read yet because she'd been focused on the content. The signature was a name she didn't recognize. Not Voss, not Vale. A different name entirely, a civilian name, attached to a title she read twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Deputy Inspector General, Office of Defense Contract Integrity. The review board had been authorized by the DIG's office. The review board was investigating procurement fraud. The document flagging her as a monitoring risk had been written by someone inside the DIG's office 14 months ago. The investigation had been compromised from inside the office that authorized it. She looked at Finch. Finch was already on her radio, voice low and controlled, calling a secure channel she hadn't used since the beginning of the evening. "This goes up," Claire said. "Yes," Finch said. "How far up?" Finch looked at her with the expression of someone standing at the edge of something they hadn't finished mapping. "That," she said, "is what we're about to find out." The mobile command unit was quiet except for the equipment in Finch's radio and the sound of Torres pulling the next file from the partition. And outside through the narrow window, the hospital's parking structure was bathed in the flat white light of the mobile unit's exterior floods. And somewhere 42 miles west, a man who had trained Claire Duval and commended her and tracked her for 14 months was not running. He was waiting. And at 11:03, Finch's secure radio came back with a response from the DIG's office that was not the response she had called for, spoken by a voice that did not belong to the agent she'd contacted. And the voice said 4 words in a measured, official tone that turned the remaining warmth out of the room entirely. "Agent Finch, stand down." Finch didn't stand down. She looked at the radio and she looked at Torres and she looked at Claire, and then she set the radio on the table with a deliberateness that was itself a decision, and she said, "That call came through on a channel that should have had 3 people on it. I called one of them." "Who answered?" Claire asked. "Not one of the 3. The room processed that in silence for about 4 seconds. "Compromised channel," Torres said, not looking up. "Or compromised people," Finch said. She reached for her personal phone, not the radio, not the agency-issued device, her personal phone, and dialed a number from memory. She held it to her ear and waited. The call connected on the 3rd ring, and she walked to the far corner of the break room and spoke in a voice too low to hear clearly, and the conversation lasted approximately 90 seconds. And when she came back, her expression had shifted into something that was not quite relief and not quite escalation, but occupied the specific space between those two things where action lives. Inspector General's office directly, she said. Not the deputy, the IG. She looked at Claire. We have a meeting at 0700 tomorrow, in person. Federal building downtown. She paused. You're part of it. On what basis? On the basis that you're the only person in this chain who has operational knowledge of Voss's command period. You have direct evidence of the monitoring document, and you put 3 of his contractors on the floor today without a service weapon, which I think establishes you as a relevant party. There was a dryness in Finch's delivery that hadn't been there 12 hours ago. Fatigue did that to competent people, stripped the professional layer until what was underneath showed through, and what was underneath Finch was someone who had a precise and highly developed sense of when an institutional system was being used against itself. The stand-down order, Claire said, will be addressed at 0700, Finch said, by someone with the authority to explain it or rescind it. And if it's not rescinded, Finch looked at her for a long moment. Then we'll find out what the order is actually protecting, she said, and that will be its own kind of answer. She slept for 4 hours in a hospital on-call room that Priya had quietly arranged, on a narrow bed in a room that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, with her knee wrapped in a compression bandage she'd put on herself using the supplies from the 3rd floor's medical storage. She slept because she had learned in the Army that sleep was not a comfort, but a tactical resource. And depleted people made structural errors, and tomorrow required that she be structurally sound. She woke at 5:40. Same time she always woke. The body didn't ask for permission. She lay on the narrow bed for 2 minutes and thought about Harlan Voss. Not with anger. The anger was there, but it was quiet. The same banked quality she'd carried about Vale for 18 months, and she'd learned by now that banked anger was more useful than the other kind. She thought about him operationally the way she would have thought about any problem that required a solution. What he had, what he needed, what he was waiting for, and what would happen when the thing he was waiting for didn't arrive. He had resources. He had a head start. He had, presumably, a plan. What he didn't have was the one thing his plan had depended on, the investigation remaining internally compromised. Whatever name was attached to that stand-down order, whatever arrangement had been protecting his position from inside the DIG's office, it had been exposed by the same laptop that had exposed everything else. The device in the wall outlet had given him 40 minutes of warning, but 40 minutes was enough to run, not enough to rebuild. He was out of plays. He just didn't know it yet, or he knew it and was looking for one more. That was the thing about people who built contingency plans into contingency plans. They kept looking for the next option past the point where the next option existed, because the alternative was accepting that the architecture they'd spent years constructing had finally come down. She wrapped her knee, dressed in the spare set of clothes Priya had produced from somewhere with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been nursing long enough to know that people sometimes needed things they hadn't asked for, and she went to find coffee. The federal building was 11 blocks from Westbrook General, and had the particular quality of federal buildings everywhere. Institutional carpet, fluorescent lights in the corridors, conference rooms with tables that were slightly too large for the number of people who sat at them. At 0700 it held more activity than its architecture suggested was normal for a Thursday morning, and the people moving through its corridors had the compressed energy of a situation that had been escalating through the night. Marsh was already there. He looked like a man who had also slept approximately 4 hours and had made peace with that. His left hand was properly wrapped now, a medical dressing rather than a cold pack, and he was in his dress uniform, which told her that whatever happened in this room today was going on record in a way that required the full weight of rank. The Inspector General herself was a woman named Adrienne Kwan, early 60s, civilian, with the kind of authority that didn't need a uniform because it had never required one. She ran the office that was supposed to be overseeing the investigation that had been compromised from inside her office, and she had the expression of someone who had spent the night learning exactly how that had happened and had not slept at all as a result. The name on the stand-down order was a deputy named Gerald Payne, who had been with the DIG's office for 9 years and had authored the monitoring document that had flagged Claire 14 months ago. By the time the 0700 meeting started, Payne was in federal custody. His arrest had happened at 5:15 at his home address, without incident, by agents who had been specifically selected from outside the standard DIG office support structure because the standard structure was now an evidence question. Kwan laid this out in approximately 4 minutes, without ornamentation. Then she looked at Finch, then at Marsh, then at Claire. "Nurse Duvall," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I've read Agent Finch's summary of yesterday's events. I've also reviewed your service record, which I now have full access to." She paused. "I want to be direct with you about what the last 14 months looked like from inside this office, and why it took until yesterday for the full picture to become visible." She laid it out. Payne had been with the office 9 years. He had moved into the review board oversight role through a lateral transfer 18 months ago. Around the same time Claire had separated from service, as it turned out, which was not coincidence. He had used his access to the board's internal communications to identify personnel who posed risk to Voss's position and had recommended monitoring protocols for 6 individuals across military and civilian sectors. He had used those same communications to route transfer requests for review board members through channels that created delays, denials, and in 2 cases, reassignments that removed members from the investigation. He had also, 9 months ago, authorized the indirect engagement of contractors for what is internal documentation described as security assessment services on persons of investigative interest. Security assessment services. The language of bureaucratic abstraction applied to the thing that had walked through Westbrook General's emergency entrance with its hand inside its jacket. "He was protecting Voss," Claire said. "He was protecting an arrangement that benefited both of them," Kwan said. The contractor network that Voss had been building for 9 years was generating revenue that moved through several layers of financial structure before any of it became traceable. Payne was receiving a portion of that revenue through a consulting arrangement that is, on paper, entirely legitimate. "On paper," Finch said. "On paper," Kwan confirmed. "We are no longer operating on paper." The meeting lasted 2 hours. Claire gave her full account 3 times to 3 different people, each of whom was documenting a different aspect of the same event chain. She described Voss's command style, his operational decision-making, the specific ways in which his management of personnel loyalty had worked during Black Summit. She described the monitoring document with the precision of someone who had read it once and retained it completely, because that was how her memory worked in high-stakes contexts. Not photographically, but structurally, the architecture of information rather than its exact surface. She described the text messages. She described the lobby. She described the second-floor corridor and what she'd found in Vale's office, and what the forensics team had pulled from the partition files. At 9:42, Kwan's phone rang. She looked at the screen, excused herself, and stepped out of the conference room for 6 minutes. When she came back, she sat down and folded her hands on the table. "Colonel Voss was apprehended at 08:57 this morning," she said, "at a private airfield 40 miles southwest of Westbrook, attempting to board a charter flight to a non-extradition jurisdiction. He is currently in federal custody." The conference room went quiet in the specific way that rooms went quiet when information landed that reorganized the preceding 24 hours into a completed shape. Claire sat with it. She had said last night that he wasn't running, that he was repositioning, looking for the next play. She had been partially right. He had been looking, but he had also been running, and the distinction she had drawn had been more about what she'd needed to believe about the man she'd served under than about what was operationally accurate. That was its own kind of information about herself. She filed it. "What were the charges?" Marsh asked. Kwan listed them. Conspiracy to defraud the federal government, obstruction of a federal investigation, solicitation of violence against a federal official, and several financial fraud counts that would require months of additional forensic accounting to fully enumerate, but whose outlines were already clear from Vale's files. 47 minutes after Voss's apprehension was announced in the conference room, Marcus Vale, who had spent the night in temporary federal custody and had been in contact with his attorney for approximately 18 of those hours, made the decision that cornered people with lawyers and exposure make when their primary co-conspirator has been arrested. He began cooperating. The cooperation was not motivated by principle. It was motivated by the calculator that ran in the back of every self-preserving person's mind, and what it calculated was that Voss had been the architecture and Vale had been an access point, and access points received different sentences than architects when the sentencing guidelines were applied correctly and the cooperation was genuine and documented. His attorney called the DIG's office at 10:17. By noon, he had provided 2 recorded statements, 1 financial disclosure affidavit, and a list of 18 additional contacts within Westbrook's administrative and contracting community who had interacted with the contractor network over the preceding 4 years. 18 people. In a hospital and its associated contractor network, that Vail had access to. The investigation that had begun as a defense procurement fraud review had become something considerably wider before lunchtime on its second full day. Says, she went back to Westbrook General at 1 in the afternoon. Not because she worked there. She had been formally separated from employment 27 hours ago, and that document still existed. But because Marsh had called the hospital's board chair directly from the federal building at 10:30, with Quan in the room, and the board chair had listened to approximately 8 minutes of information about what had happened within his institution, and had called an emergency board session for noon. She wasn't at the board session. She didn't need to be. What she did was go to the 3rd floor because she knew the floor, and the floor needed to be walked, and because the morning's chart review had revealed 3 things that the current nursing team needed to know that the night shift handoff might not have captured cleanly. Priya saw her come through the door and didn't say anything, just moved aside from the nurse's station and made room. She spent 2 hours on the floor. She had no badge and no formal authority, and she reviewed the charts anyway, because the patients hadn't been part of yesterday's institutional failure, and their care didn't stop while their hospital's administration was being dismantled from the executive tier down. The 62-year-old in 314 had started her cultures, and the preliminary results were consistent with what Claire had flagged. Early SSY, caught in time, the attending had updated the treatment protocol at 7 that morning. Gerald's arm was properly elevated, and he was scheduled for discharge the following day, which was exactly where he should be. She fixed a medication timing error in Bay 2 that had been entered incorrectly during the lockdown confusion and would have caused a manageable but unnecessary problem in about 6 hours. She flagged a patient in Bay 7 for neurological evaluation based on a symptom presentation that the admitting notes described as resolved, but which the patient's own account of that morning suggested was not. She did this because it needed doing. She did it without announcement. She did it the way she always did everything, which was to find the task that was actually in front of her and do it to the full extent of her capability, regardless of whether anyone was watching, because the alternative, doing less than you could, calibrating your effort to the visibility of the audience, was a form of dishonesty she'd never been able to practice. Donald found her at 3:15. He stood at the nurse's station and looked at her and said, "You shouldn't be here without a badge." "Probably not," she said. "The board meeting went 3 hours," he said. "That's what I heard." "What did you hear about the outcome?" "That Vail's termination is effective today. That there's an interim administration committee pending appointment of a new chief administrator." He paused. "That the nursing staff complaints about workplace conduct are being reviewed by an external body, not internal HR." Another pause. "That your termination is under review." "Under review," she said. "That's the language they're using." She looked at the chart in front of her. Under review was institutional language for something that had already been decided but hadn't been communicated in the format that made it official, and she understood that, and she also understood that she was sitting in a space between 2 states, the state of being fired and the state of not being fired. And the space in between was not comfortable, but it was familiar territory for someone who had spent a lot of years operating in the gap between what the institution said and what was actually true. "The complaint," she said. "You submitted it before federal guidance." "Yes." "Why?" Donald was quiet for a moment. He was a large man who moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who had learned to be careful with their own physical presence. And when he was thinking about something important, he went still in a way that was very different from his ordinary stillness. "Because waiting for perfect conditions to do the right thing," he said, "is how the right thing never gets done." He paused. "And because I've watched you work this floor for 18 months and I know what I saw, and what I saw was someone who showed up every single day and did the job completely, and what happened in that conference room was not a personnel decision. It was a punishment. And I don't work somewhere that punishes people for doing the job correctly and just document my objection and wait." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. It came out less formal than she intended, which meant it came out correctly. He nodded once, went back to work. Voss's arrest became public at 6 in the evening, when the Federal Communications Office released a statement that was formal and precise and contained between its lines enough information for any experienced journalist to understand the dimensions of what had been uncovered. By 7, 3 news organizations had stories running. By 8, the stories had Westbrook General in the headline, not as an institution implicated in the fraud, but as the location where a federal investigation had come to a dramatic operational head. By 9, the hospital's board chair had released a public statement that acknowledged the federal investigation, expressed the board's full cooperation, and included a specific paragraph about the wrongful termination review currently underway for a member of the nursing staff who had, in the statement's careful language, demonstrated exceptional conduct under extraordinary circumstances. She read the statement on her phone in the on-call room where she'd slept 4 hours the night before, sitting on the same narrow bed, her leg extended, the compression bandage still in place. The language was institutional and hedged in the way that legal teams made everything institutional and hedged. And it described what she'd done through the filter of what it meant for the hospital's liability exposure rather than what it meant as an event in itself. And she found she didn't mind that. Institutions communicated in the language of institutions. The meaning was still there underneath. Her phone rang at 9:23. Marsh. The board chair called me an hour ago, he said. He wanted context for the public statement. What did you give him? Enough. He paused. You've been formally cleared by the DIG's office. The monitoring document is being expunged from your record. Your classified service file is being sealed at a higher level. Another pause. The commendation from Black Summit stands. There was some discussion about whether Voss's signature on it compromised its validity, and the conclusion was that it didn't. The operational record it references is independent of who signed the paper. She looked at the wall across from the bed. The narrow room had a single print on it. A landscape, mountains, anonymous. The kind of print that existed in institutional spaces because someone had once decided that blank walls were worse than this and hadn't been wrong, but also hadn't been particularly right. There's something else, Marsh said. Tell me. The emergency trauma protocols you implemented yesterday during the lockdown. The specific sequence, the pediatric isolation decision, the positioning of personnel. The tactical team lead put it in his after-action report. A pause. He described it as the most efficient civilian emergency response he'd personally observed. She didn't say anything. I know that's not... Marsh stopped, started again. I know that's not the thing you did it for. No, she said. I know. I'm telling you because it's documented, because it's on record, because the version of yesterday where you're a nurse who got fired for conduct during a military inspection doesn't exist anymore. And the version that does exist is the accurate one, and it's in the federal record and the hospital's record and the after-action report of a tactical team lead who has seen a lot of emergency responses in his career. He paused once more. You deserve to know that's what exists now. She sat with that. It was harder to receive than she'd expected, not because she doubted it, but because she'd spent a long time in the space where the accurate version wasn't the official version, and collapsing that space felt less like relief and more like the specific disorientation of a weight you'd been carrying so long that the absence of it changed your center of gravity. What happens to the review board, she asked. Reconstituted. New membership, vetted through a process Quan is designing that's being kept entirely outside the existing oversight structure until it's complete. He paused. I'm staying on as chair. Quan asked. I said yes. Good. The investigation itself will take months. The contractor network is larger than the initial scope suggested. Payne's cooperation has opened additional threads. A pause. It's going to be a long process. It usually is, she said. The right ones always are. But she went back to work on Monday. Not in the same capacity as before. Not yet. The board had requested 2 weeks for the formal reinstatement process, the HR review, the documentation that institutional accountability required even when the conclusion was obvious, and she understood the process, and she had given herself the 2 weeks to rest her knee, which her orthopedist confirmed was a partial ligament aggravation that would resolve with appropriate care and would not resolve without it. She rested. She was not good at resting. She read the 60 pages remaining in the paperback novel she'd been working through for 4 months, and discovered that the ending was satisfying in a quiet way that she hadn't expected, which she found disproportionately moving and recognized as the emotional fragility that followed adrenaline depletion in people who had been operating at maximum capacity for an extended period. She iced her knee 3 times a day and did the physical therapy exercises her orthopedist had given her, which were boring and effective. She answered Finch's calls when they came, 4 times in the 2 weeks, progressively shorter as the investigation's documentation phase absorbed the case's active energy. She answered Marsh's calls twice. She didn't answer the calls from 2 journalists who got her number through channels she didn't want to trace. Not because she was afraid of the story was already out there. In the Federal Record and the hospital's public statement and the after-action report and the news coverage that had run in the week following Voss's arrest. But because the story that mattered to her was not the one that would make good television, and the one that made good television was not the one she wanted to be responsible for shaping. The one that mattered to her was smaller. It was Priya making space at the nurses' station. It was Donald submitting a complaint before he'd been advised to and being right to do so. It was Gerald asking the floor officer if the nurse with the limp was okay, which was the thing a 67-year-old man had done from his hospital bed in the middle of a building lockdown because he'd paid enough attention in 4 minutes of interaction to know that she was a specific person worth asking about. Those were the things that had held, not the commendation or the Federal Record or the tactical team lead's after-action report. Those mattered, and she didn't dismiss them. But they were the official version, and the official version was always the one that came after. What it held during the 18 months before the official version existed was the work itself, done completely, for the patients in front of her, in a building that had not known what she was and had not deserved to. She went back on a Monday morning, 6:47, 3rd floor, same as always. The IV pump on Bay 4 had been replaced with a new unit during the 2 weeks, which she noted with something approaching satisfaction. The charge nurse on the overnight team gave her the handoff the way charge nurses gave handoffs. Fast, clinical, efficient, and then paused at the end of it. "Glad you're back," she said. Not elaborated on, not decorated, just said. "Thank you," Claire said, in the same register. She started her assessments. At 10:15, Marsh arrived on the 3rd floor, not in dress uniform, in civilian clothes, which she hadn't seen him in, and which made him look different in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. He found her in the corridor outside room 312 and waited until she'd finished noting her assessment before he spoke. "The board approved the proposal this morning," he said. She looked at him. "Which proposal?" "The trauma response curriculum. For hospital staff, nursing, emergency medicine, security personnel. Based on the protocol sequence from the incident," he paused. "The board wants it developed in-house, with someone who can speak to both the clinical and tactical elements." She understood what he was asking before he said it. "I'm a floor nurse," she said. "You're also the person who wrote the protocol in the moment and had it work, which is a better credential than a committee. It would take time outside the floor. The board is proposing a split role. Curriculum development 3 days a week, clinical work 2 days. Contingent on your agreement." He looked at her steadily. "It's not an order, it's a question." She thought about it. She thought about what it meant to have a use for the specific architecture of knowledge she carried. The tactical and the clinical layered together, the things she'd built across years that no single environment had previously needed in the combination it existed in her. She thought about the patients on her floor and the fact that 2 days a week was not enough. And she thought about the fact that the curriculum, if it was done correctly and not just performed correctly, could make every nurse and every security officer in this building more effective in a crisis, which multiplied beyond what she alone could do on 2 clinical days. She thought about the fact that she had been making herself small for 18 months, not hiding exactly, but not taking up the full space that she was entitled to take, and that the smallness had not protected her, and had not helped the people around her, and had not served anything except the comfort of people like Vale, who needed the people around them to be smaller than they were in order to feel adequately large. "Yes," she said. It was a short answer. It was the whole answer. Marsh nodded. He looked like someone who had expected a longer negotiation and was pleased that one hadn't been necessary. "There's a board presentation in 3 weeks," he said. "They'll want an outline of the curriculum structure." I'll have it in 2. He almost smiled again. I didn't doubt it. He left. She went back to her assessments. At noon, she ate lunch in the break room, a sandwich that had been properly refrigerated this time, which was a small improvement and one she registered without irony. Priya sat across from her for 10 minutes between tasks and didn't say much, which was the comfortable silence of people who had been through something together and didn't need to keep explaining it. How's the knee? Priya asked. Better than it was. Will it? No, Claire said. It won't go back to what it was before. But before wasn't what it was before the deployment either. It adjusts. She paused. Everything does, eventually. Priya looked at her with the expression she'd worn in the hallway on the morning of the inspection, the one that carried more than it said. What you did in that lobby, she said. What you did on the second floor. I've been trying to find the right thing to say about it for 2 weeks. You don't need to say anything. I know, I want to. Priya was quiet for a moment. We work in a place where people come in at their worst, scared, hurt, not thinking clearly. And we try to hold the room for them. Keep it steady. Make it safe enough for them to get through whatever they're in the middle of. She paused. You did that for the whole building. Claire looked at her sandwich. I dropped my cardboard box, she said. Priya looked at her. In the lobby, when I saw the men come in, I dropped the box and my stethoscope went across the floor and I never picked it back up. She paused. Thomas found it and put it in his office. He gave it back to me this morning. Priya's mouth did something complicated that resolved into an expression Claire didn't have a precise name for. Not quite a smile. Something with more depth than that. That's the least important part of what happened, Priya said. I know, Claire said, but it's the part I keep seeing. Because that was the thing they didn't put in after-action reports. The cardboard box, the scattered compression socks, the paperback that ended up against the baseboard, the specific indignity of the moment that preceded everything else. The version of events in the federal record began when she'd crossed the lobby and picked up the IV stand. The version that existed in her own memory began 10 seconds earlier, with a box hitting the floor and the contents going everywhere, and her standing in the middle of it making the decision to leave it behind. That was where things actually started, most of the time. Not in the competence, not in the training, not in the call sign, and what it meant. In the moment you chose to turn back toward the thing you'd been walking away from, with your hands empty and your box on the floor and nothing figured out yet. That was the whole story, really. Everything else was just what happened after you made that choice. She finished her sandwich. She washed her hands. She went back to the floor where a 64-year-old man in Bay 3 needed his medication adjusted, and a new admission in Bay 7 needed a proper neurological intake that the attending hadn't done yet, and the IV pump on Bay 4, the new one, was already throwing a different error than the old one, which meant she was going to need to call biomedical, and she was going to do it now rather than leaving it for the next shift. She did all of it. Not because anyone was watching, and not because it would be in a report, and not because she was trying to prove something to an institution that had spent 18 months failing to see her correctly. She did it because the work was in front of her, and it needed doing, and she was exactly the person who could do it. That had always been true. It would always be true. And for the first time in a very long time, the place where she was standing knew it too.